Good morning and welcome back to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if the decolonization never happened. When we are speaking of decolonization, we mostly refer to the decolonization of Africa, Asia, and only some parts of the Americas. Most of Latin America, for instance, was technically decolonized, and we will not discuss whether Latin America was truly independent or not, as this would deserve its own video. Nowadays we are looking at the map of our world, and we see many independent countries that are the product of colonization or imperialism. Remember the famous straight lines in Africa, for instance. Yep, that's a product of colonization and imperialism. The decolonization process in Africa took many years, and also depending on the country it took longer, or it actually happened much earlier. And in some parts we could even say that the decolonization technically never ended. And I'm talking mostly about Western Sahara, because most of its land is controlled by Morocco. The main players in Africa who colonized, they were Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium, Italy, Spain, Germany also for some time, and in some way or another even South Africa. While the British colonies, they had not big problems getting their independence, France saw an important war happening in Algeria. And this was for a very specific reason. France saw northern Algeria as part of the French motherland, and it was not just a colony. While parts of Gabon or Burkina Faso, they were treated as a colony and they had a very different status. Germany and Italy had a complex history after World War II. Spain had almost no colonial possessions in Africa except for Equatorial Guinea and Western Sahara, the former getting independence without bigger issues and the latter being controlled by Morocco nowadays. Portugal fought a very expensive colonial war to keep their colonies. Belgium had Congo, Rwanda and Burundi and was happy to give them their independence. Actually, they gave it too fast. And then South Africa, which after apartheid had to abandon Namibia. Asia too saw complicated evolution with Indochina, India, Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, and many more countries getting their independence as well. The Caribbean, mostly former British territories, got their independence too, as well as the Pacific Island nations, and then there are still parts that are now controlled by France or by the Netherlands, but they are not truly considered colonies. As we can see, the rest of the world was mostly divided by very specific European countries. And I'm not talking about the Polands, the Czechias, the Slovakias or Finlands or Hungaries, but mostly about Britain, France, Portugal, Netherlands, Spain, Belgium, and even Italy to some degree. So what if all of that changed? What if the decolonization never happened? First of all, let's be clear about one thing. This scenario is pretty much ASB in itself. However, there are ways how we can potentially extend colonization and maybe even avoid decolonization altogether. The fact that we have only a few countries that mostly participated in the colonization makes it somewhat easier to avoid the decolonization from happening. There are, however, two important factors to count in. After World War II, the USSR and the US were both against colonialism. When France and Britain fought against Egypt, the US actually sided with the Soviets in that conflict in 1956. Another factor is that overall the weakness of Europe was very strong, especially after 2 world wars. The economy was damaged, the military power wasn't that huge anymore, and people were also just fed up with wars in general. We could just go and say, you know what, let's just avoid World War I and World War II altogether. That could work. But then we would actually discuss a very different scenario. So instead, let's just say that the colonies would be more integrated, and we could see something akin to Lusotropicalism arise much earlier on in this scenario. Ideas of an imperial federation as well, giving more rights to the colonized people. Of course, not everything would happen immediately, but most of it happened when it was already too late. In this alternate timeline, such efforts to integrate the colonies would happen decades earlier. This would of course have some repercussions, but we'll just assume that everything would go on as usual. The colonized population as well as the colonizers would not always be in favor of such policies, where the colonies and the motherland would basically become one singular country at some point. Remember, we are talking about the years where racial segregation, superiority, etc. it was still very normal, not to mention the religious and cultural differences. To counter that, the governments of the colonizing empires would have to spend more money into their army, which means that European countries will be far less wealthy than in OTR. Keeping the colonies for a longer time would also not make the Europeans richer, and sometimes the colonies were actually a drain on the state budget. The US in this timeline would not be against colonialism per se, seeing how they too actually held lands that had not the same rights as states within the US. As a result, the US would not condemn colonialism, as they would be hypocritical for doing so. Moreover, rebel movements would take a bit longer to become established in the colonies in this timeline, and with less wealth in Europe and the Cold War still rampaging, the Europeans could blame communism or socialism for sponsoring state terrorism and loss of sovereignty. Remember, in this timeline, all the colonies would eventually become an integral part of a country or a system, and independence would just not be an option. Africa and Asia will have a much bigger percentage of Europeans living in there, but Europe too would have a bigger percentage of non-Europeans living in Europe. Since the colonized population, they would eventually have to enjoy the same rights as Europeans. This would be the only way in order to keep the whole system together. We could see smaller parliaments for England, Scotland, Wales, parts of Portugal and even mainland France arise. But on top of those, we could see some type of federal parliaments arise as well, with many non-Europeans representing their constituencies. Europeans themselves would not be happy about this, and instead of seeing colonial wars, we may actually see Europeans rebelling against it, or the rise of extreme right parties. However, this would be crushed by the police or the army, as would the rebel movements within the colonies. Fascism and communism would simply be blamed for it, a discourse about better education would be propagated all across the radio, TV, newspaper, and life would just go on as usually. While most of Europe would be poorer, more investments could be seen in Africa, Asia, Pacific, the Caribbean. I'm not going to say that these places will be now better off thanks to the Europeans, but with the lack of civil war, political struggle, proxy wars, etc., the additional peacetime would give rise to such investments. Places like Nauru, for instance, would be better off than in OTL. Moreover, the Soviet Union would also spend less money, but also at the same time win less money, due to less countries buying their military equipment, for instance. The Cold War may actually never truly end in this alternate timeline because of the West being too busy with their own issues and not being able to truly challenge the Soviets and exert their power externally. The US too would probably support the Europeans unofficially, and as a result there would be no arms race against the Soviet Union. Gorbachev, if he would still become leader, may actually succeed in this timeline with his reforms. The Europeans would not export their factories to China, and the US too would see no need for doing so, and much of the factories they would just be exported in the Anglophone parts of Africa or India, for instance. While all of it may sound good on paper, I truly believe that inequality would be much bigger on a global scale. Sure, some industries they would be built, colonized people would become citizens and have equal rights, but they would just never really feel as a citizen of, let's say, France, Britain, Belgium and so on. Even the natives of France, Britain, Belgium, they would not really feel part of such a federation. A lot of their money would be spent somewhere in Africa, Asia, places that they have even no clue about, and many laws would be made by Africans, Asians, foreigners. The resources from the colonies they would also not enrich the Europeans, but only a small business class in these colonies. Yes, they would most likely be whites, but it would not benefit the general population in Europe. Many conflicts between natives and colonized populations against the state would happen eventually. And if the economy as well as inequality in wealth wouldn't be improved, decolonization would happen in one way or another, even perhaps initiated by the Europeans back home, because they didn't want to spend more money in the colonies. And that's where we leave it for now.
That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Alt History.